All right, let's get right into it. When you think about Arabia before Islam, the picture that usually comes to mind is pretty straightforward. A landscape of idol worship that was totally transformed by the Prophet Muhammad and the idea of one God. But inside the Islamic tradition itself, there's this fascinating story about a group called the Hanifs. They were supposedly these pure native monotheists, followers of the original religion of Abraham, who had already rejected the idols. They're often seen as the missing link.
But here's where the mystery really begins, and it's a huge twist. What if the very word used to describe these pure believers, these ultimate insiders, was actually borrowed from another language where it meant the complete opposite? What if it meant pagan, heathen, a total outsider? This one linguistic paradox is the key to unlocking a 1,400-year-old historical puzzle.
So for the next few minutes, I want you to think of this not as a history lesson, but as a detective story. We are investigating a cold case. The scene of the crime is a 1,400-year-old text. The evidence is complex. And the witnesses, well, they're separated from the events by centuries. Our mission is to figure out who the Hanifs really were.
Every good investigation has to start with the primary source. Before we get into any legends or later histories, we have to ask a simple question. What does the Qur'an itself, our earliest and most important piece of evidence, actually say about these Hanifs? You might be surprised by how specific the answer is.
The word Hanif shows up just 12 times. That's it. And when it does, it's not really describing a community or some kind of social movement happening in Mecca. Instead, the Quran uses it almost like a high-powered adjective, and it's nearly always attached to one single towering figure, Abraham.
This right here is the perfect example. The Quran is making a really bold strategic claim. It's saying, look, Abraham came before both Judaism and Christianity, so he doesn't belong to either of them. By calling him a Hanif, the scripture is basically carving out a new lane, a claim to an authentic original monotheism that's completely independent of the religious authorities of the day. It's a massive identity claim.
Okay, so let's move on to our next piece of evidence, the witness testimonies. Now, these come from the later Islamic biographies, known as the Sirah, and they were written down centuries after the events they describe. This is where we get all those rich, detailed stories about specific Hanif figures, people like Ziyad ibn Arm, who was searching for the one true God, or Waraka ibn Nawfal, the learned Christian cousin of the Prophet's wife.
But, and this is a huge but for any historian, just look at this timeline. You've got a gap of 120 to 200 years between the life of the Prophet and the first time these biographies were written down. That entire time, these were oral traditions, stories being told and retold, shaped and polished. So the big question we have to ask is, are we reading pure, unvarnished history, or are we reading what scholars call theological memory, a narrative that was crafted later on to give Islam deep, indigenous roots in Arabia?
Just when you think the case is about sorting early texts from later memories, the field of linguistics comes in and throws a massive wrench into the whole thing. This next clue challenges the very meaning of the word Hanif and suggests something truly radical was going on.
Okay, get ready for this. In Syriac, which was a major language spoken all over the region back then, the similar-sounding word hampa meant pagan or heathen. It was an insult. So a really influential scholar named Arthur Jeffrey came up with this game-changing theory that the Quran pulled off a brilliant linguistic maneuver he called re-semanticization. It essentially took a slur used for outsiders, flipped it on its head, and reclaimed it as a badge of ultimate honor, the truest, most pure kind of believer.
So we've looked at texts, we've looked at memories, and we've looked at linguistics. But what about actual physical proof? Let's turn to the stones, to the inscriptions that people in pre-Islamic Arabia actually left behind. And this is where the trail goes completely cold.
Zero, zilch, nada. For a historian, that number isn't just a blank space. It's a piece of evidence in itself. It's a profound, almost deafening silence right where we would expect to hear a voice.
I mean, think about it. Archaeologists have dug up thousands of these rock inscriptions from the period. They talk about all sorts of gods and goddesses. They show clear proof of Jewish and Christian communities living there. They even use the word Allah for a high god. But in all of that ancient graffiti, not one single time does anyone identify themselves as a Hanif. For historians, that absence of evidence is a really powerful clue.
So let's recap the case file. We have a powerful theological term in the Quran, we have these vivid stories from later traditions, we have a linguistic bombshell, and then we have a complete lack of physical proof. So how in the world do scholars try to make sense of all this?
Well, generally, the theories fall into three main buckets. First, you have the idea that the Hanifs were a real, organized historical movement. The big problem there, that archaeological silence we just talked about. Second, there's the theory that Hanif is more of a literary construct, a theological category invented by the Qur'an, that later storytellers filled in with details. This one's pretty strong, but it doesn't quite explain everything. And finally, there's the Nazarene hypothesis, which suggests Hanifs might have been a kind of code name for obscure Jewish-Christian sects. It's a super compelling idea for the time, but there's just no paper trail. No proof of these groups in Mecca.
And, just to make things even more complicated, we have to deal with what I like to call the poetry problem. The tradition has saved these poems, supposedly from figures like Umayyah ibn Abi al-Salt, a so-called Hanif poet. And the crazy thing is, his poetry about God and the Day of Judgment sounds an awful lot like the Qur'an. So is this the smoking gun?
Well, not so fast. A lot of top-tier scholars, people like Nikolai Sinai and Tor Andre, argue this poetry is basically a scholarly trap. They think it's likely pseudo-epigraphic. That's a fancy word that means it was falsely attributed. In other words, it was forged, or at least heavily edited much later on. I mean, think about it. The poetry fits a little too perfectly. It serves as the ideal literary prequel to the Qur'an. The argument is that later Muslims created this poetry to build a backstory, to show that these monotheistic ideas were already floating around in Arabia.
Okay, we have examined the textual evidence, the witness testimonies, the linguistic forensics, and the missing physical proof. It's time to put all the clues together and deliver the scholarly verdict on the mystery of the Hanifs.
So here's the bottom line. The idea of the Hanif works as a theological bypass. In a world where Judaism and Christianity were the established monotheistic brands, the Hanif concept allowed the early Muslim community to claim the original, most pure version of monotheism, Abraham's religion, without having to go through either of them. It let them bypass their authority completely.
And that brings us to the final conclusion. The Hanifs are probably not a lost historical missing link that we're ever going to find with a shovel. It's much more useful to think of them as a theological bridge that was constructed by the scripture itself, a bridge that was specifically designed to connect the new revelation in 7th century Arabia directly back to the original monotheist, Abraham.
So to sum up the modern scholarly consensus, it goes something like this. 1. Were there individual spiritual seekers in Arabia who were rejecting idols and looking for one God? Absolutely, that's historically plausible. 2. Is there any solid evidence for a structured, organized Hanif movement? Nope. 3. In the Quran, the word Hanif is mainly a theological identity marker for Abraham. And 4. Later Islamic tradition took that powerful theological idea and fleshed it out with names, stories, and poems, turning it into a rich historical narrative.
And all of this leaves us with one final, really provocative question. The story of the Hanif serves this incredibly profound theological purpose. It roots Islam in the sacred geography of Arabia and in the ancient purity of Abraham. So you have to ask yourself, for a founding story to be theologically powerful, does it actually need to be historically, literally, archaeologically true in every single detail? That's definitely something worth thinking about.